Okay, so I'm sure that many of my regular viewers will know that I like to review Meghan Markle's erroneously titled podcast, Archetypes. And I, like many of you, find the title of that podcast very annoying because really what Meghan is discussing in her podcast are stereotypes, if that. And what makes that title doubly annoying for me is that I find archetypes and psychology and stuff like that really interesting, and the fact that there's a podcast called Archetypes which promises so much and then delivers fuck all. The frustration, I can only compare it to when I was a child and Working Lunch used to come on, and the title sequence with the shark chasing the fish. I was psyched, and it was just Adrian Chiles talking about money and inflation and stuff. I don't know what he was talking about. There was graphs. Anyway, I digress. It's like Godwin's law with me. The longer I talk, the more likely it is I'll end up talking about not Hitler, but Adrian Chiles, England's Hitler. I'm joking, he's a lovely man. Possibly, I don't know him. Just Googling him now, I found out he had a relationship with Catherine Tate, which I was unaware of. Why was I not informed? Shut up about Adrian Chiles. Kathy, however, is a good segue into what I want to talk about today in today's video. Because I want to discuss some actual archetypes. Not the word bitch, or bimbo, or thornback, spinster, gormasapsi, adobo. And the reason Kathy is a good segue, because I've lost my way again, is because I'm going to do it by talking about 3 Bronte sister novels.
You know, not everybody is equipped to or interested in engaging in high-level discussion of abstract and creative ideas.
Well, that may be true, Jordan, but my audience, I think you guys can handle today's video. And on a semi-serious note, before we get started, I might get a few things confused. These are all my ideas, having read those novels, the novels that I'm going to talk about. I'm no hyper-intellectual. I'm not a professional journalist. I've got no degree in literature. I'm barely literate. So if you're new to the channel, don't be too harsh in the comments section. Oh, and by the way, those of you who are new to the channel or returning and haven't subscribed, 65% of my audience have not subscribed. What the hell is going on? That's not helping the algorithm. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 books today that really changed the way my brain works a little bit. And I don't know if that's because I'm not hyper intellectual, as I said, and I'm a bit simple and sort of big ideas make me go, I feel like I've made some massive discovery and then I'm just talking to other people about it and they're like, yeah, everyone knows that. Forgive me! Okay, so quite a few years ago now, the first Bronte sister novel that I read was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Then last year, I think it was, I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And then just yesterday, I finished The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. Is that right? I think I got that right. The first one I'm going to talk about is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I guess because it's freshest in my memory, and I think it's the one I least like of the 3. But possibly one of the most interesting in terms of archetypes. And of course at this point I think it's very important to say, spoiler alert, if you haven't read these books, I'm going to ruin them for you. So what's archetypical about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall? Well, I think it's one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of a narcissist. Any of you who are, like myself, avid consumers of pop psychology on YouTube will know what they think of, an image that comes into their head, a set of behaviours that you associate with a narcissist. So just briefly, the story goes that Gilbert Markham, the initial protagonist and narrator of the story, tells the readers through a series of letters to a friend he refers to as Halford. He tells us how he came to meet Helen Graham, who is this mysterious, beautiful woman who has moved in with her young child to Wildfell Hall. And as she hasn't moved in with her husband, it would appear to everyone in the neighbourhood that she is a widow. And so initially Gilbert is just very interested in her because she's very attractive, she doesn't have a husband, she's about his age, and she's very aloof, and he's kind of like a cocky, good-looking young gentleman who thinks, well, I'll show her. So it seems initially as though Gilbert just kind of sets out to conquer her. He sees his angle as befriending her 5-year-old son. So he sort of goes and approaches him in her garden and lets him play with his dog and all this kind of thing. So it just seems like it's going to be a typical romance or something like that. It just seems initially like she's testing him, she's keeping her distance, she's probably upset because her husband's died or something like that. But then, you know, they start spending more and more time together. He's really good with her son, and they form a bond, and clearly they seem to be falling in love with each other genuinely. They have quite a deep connection. Anyway, not to go into too many details, but essentially Helen Graham lets Gilbert Markham know on many occasions throughout the relationship that she cannot marry him and that they can never be anything more than friends. But she can't tell him why she won't marry him, and that's what starts to drive Gilbert insane, and there are rumours circulating in the neighbourhood about all kinds of things, that she's still married, or that she's having an affair with this person or that person. And so finally Gilbert demands an explanation from her. So Miss Graham's response is to hand Gilbert her personal diary, which details the last 5 or 6 or 7 years of her life. And here is where we are introduced to the narcissist, her love interest, then fiancé, then husband, and father of her child, Arthur Huntingdon. Arthur Huntingdon, the love interest, is initially introduced to us as this very charming, very good-looking young gentleman who I think stands out to Helen Graham because her other potential suitors are these sort of horrible, pervy old men. And Arthur is young and good-looking and funny, charismatic. And Helen, as a naive 18-year-old, doesn't see any of the red flags. She just describes his behaviour as candidly as she experiences it in her diary. But it is brilliantly described, and the first few things that you see in his character which are a bit odd are, for example, when Helen doesn't show him enough attention, he immediately ignores her and starts putting all of his efforts into other women and pretends she just doesn't exist. He completely shuts her out. Nowadays, we'd be able to express that as passive-aggressive behaviour, entitlement. He thinks he should be the centre of attention at all times. He seems to be genuinely offended when Helen doesn't do exactly what he wants, like he believes that he's so important that he can't even conceive that other people don't see that. And eventually when they get married, the lying starts. He contrives situations where Helen is sort of sent away to the house in the country, and he spends a few days initially in London, which turn into a few weeks, which turn into months of him basically on these massive alcohol-induced benders with ladies of the night and his friends at the boys' club. All the while, albeit on and off, corresponding by letter to his wife, Helen, and he makes these vague excuses about how he's there on business and can't get away because it's so important, but he doesn't go into details about what exactly he's doing in London. And when he eventually comes back after this months-long initial bender that he goes on in London with his pals, he's completely changed. He's not the man she married. He's not this jovial, happy-go-lucky, good-looking young gentleman. He's clearly an alcoholic, and we start to see the first episodes of abuse, verbal and physical. The first real incident of note, by the way, I found really, really interesting because it's exactly what a narcissist will do, this inching process where they take up more and more terrain. You know, the more you let them abuse you, the more they will abuse you. You know, they keep pushing the limit further and further and further. And the first violent episode we see from him is when he abuses his favourite spaniel. He's sort of lying around the house, irritable, probably hungover, I think, if I remember correctly. And the dog doesn't obey him in some way, and he hits it a couple of times, and he throws a heavy book at it, which cuts Helen's hand, and it's all Helen's fault. If he drinks too much, it's Helen's fault. If he's bored, it's because she's not entertaining him. All of the limitations that Arthur has, whether that be from his personal conduct, his inability to control his vices, whether it be the fact that he doesn't have as much money as he thinks he deserves, or societal norms restrict him in some way, all of that is blamed on his wife. But as I say, it's very gradual. Initially, it just sort of looks like petty irritability. And at length, he makes excuses for himself and half apologises, but he continues to inch and eat away at Helen. As time goes on, his excuses become increasingly vague, he becomes less apologetic, but Helen sees it as her cross to bear. The ideas of separation or divorce don't even occur to Helen because, well, first of all, she's very religious and believes that it's, till death do us part. We promised ourselves to each other in the eyes of God, it's a sin to separate. And she genuinely feels that. And of course, we've got to remember that at the time, divorce was a scandal. In high society especially, and it could mean your financial ruin and social exclusion, particularly for women. What makes Helen start to question that worldview, though, is the fact that she's got her young son, also named Arthur, growing up and starting to become aware of his father's debauchery, to the point where the child is swearing at her and she has to wean him off wine and gin and brandy. Which, interestingly enough, is what leads to the first conversation between Gilbert and Miss Graham. Helen won't allow her 5-year-old son to drink wine, and everyone thinks he's a big pansy. And Gilbert says, well, you have to expose young boys to the dangers of the world, and she absolutely refuses to expose her child to any kind of vice whatsoever. And here is where we find out why. She still seems to harbour some belief that her husband was essentially a good person who was corrupted by his surroundings, which is a big debate that, for another day. Anyway, back to the narcissist. Arthur Huntingdon's behaviour sort of culminates in this sort of outrageously inappropriate behaviour in the family home when his friends are staying there for weeks and months on end, as they used to do back then for some reason. I don't know, I guess they didn't have social media, did they? They'd spend months in each other's stately homes, and at Grassdale Hall, I think is the name of the place where they live. The friends are staying there for a couple of months, and he is behaving very inappropriately with one of his friends' wives. They're very flirtatious with one another, and it turns out he's having a full-blown affair. Helen finds out when she follows him out one evening after a tip-off from one of her husband's friends. She follows him out and sees him talking with his lover, Mrs. Lady Lowborough, I believe her name is. And when he is discovered, Arthur behaves exactly like you'd expect a narcissist to behave when there is absolutely no way for them to lie their way out of yet another situation. He has nothing left but to just accept the truth. He's angry. He has an angry response. He doesn't feel sorry. He's not apologetic. He doesn't make any excuses because he knows that she knows the truth. So, well, fuck her, and he's very aggressive, and he makes all sorts of threats about how she cannot leave him because he's not going to be the talk of the town. He's not letting her leave because he wants to make amends and he wants them to learn to love each other again. When she talks of leaving him, he's worried about what the neighbours will think, and it's just amazing. To me, I couldn't believe what I was reading, because we see this a lot nowadays, and it's amazing to think that people have essentially always had these same capacities. We're talking 160 years ago when this book was written. You've got this guy who has no respect for anyone, no empathy for anyone, obsessed with himself, barely hiding anything that he does. All of his friends know that he's having an affair. His wife now knows that he's having an affair. He's not hiding anything really from anyone, but there's this perception in his worldview that, well, no one can actually say anything because my wife hasn't left me, she's there. It's like, to him, no, what are you talking about? You can't go around saying I'm having an affair, I'm married. You can't say I'm a wild drunk because my wife hasn't left me. I'm not that bad, clearly. And so once his cover is blown behind closed doors, he's extremely abusive to Helen, to his wife, and he shows her nothing but hatred, and he mistreats the staff. He becomes more and more dependent on alcohol, and that isn't the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's the fact that Arthur, the son, is having to see all of this. So Helen makes the decision eventually to leave her husband because that outweighs her duty to her marriage vows, right? She thinks that it's more evil to allow her son to grow up around this man and be an influence on his life than it is to break her marriage vows. And this is a common theme through all of the Bronte novels that I've read, this struggle between good and evil, what is right and what is wrong. And I won't ruin the ending for you, so you can still read it from what I've told you, I think, more or less, because you don't know how it turns out. So, and they're not always happy endings, by the way, the Bronte sister novels. So, and I think this of the three that I mentioned is probably the least favourite. So, I don't know, if you've enjoyed this video, I know it's very different to what I normally do. If you've got this far, let me know in the comments, do you want to see me talk about the other two novels that I initially said I was going to, until I got, you know, a quarter of an hour into this one and realised, oh God, there's no way I can do this all in one video. I'd like to, and I think I will at some point, sooner or later, depending on your comments, I'm going to make a video about Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, just because I've always wanted to. So, I don't know, is that something people want to see? Let me know. Like, share, subscribe, I guess. I wonder how many people want this kind of content. Book reviews from Bronte sister novels, God knows. And not very good ones either, probably, you know, if you're studying literature or whatever. But if you like pop psychology, I think this was bloody brilliant.